My name is Linda Cooper. I am 66 years old, a widow, and the mother of a son I once believed would never turn his back on me. Tonight, as I sat down to share what should have been a proud moment, I realized how far apart we had drifted. I can still see it so clearly. The restaurant glowed with crystal lights, velvet chairs, and laughter spilling from every corner. I walked toward the table where my son, Michael, and his wife, Caroline, were seated. I thought I would join them, celebrate his promotion, raise a glass to everything he had achieved. Instead, I froze. There were only 2 chairs, one for him, one for her, none for me. I stood there, awkward, waiting for someone to notice. When Michael finally looked up, he leaned back with a smirk, loud enough for everyone around to hear. He told me to go sit outside with beggars. I felt the words land like stones against my chest. And then Caroline, polished in her designer dress, tilted her glass with that little smile that cuts sharper than a knife. She told me not everyone belonged at a table like this. In that moment, I felt my face burn, my hands tremble, but I would not let them see me break. I straightened my back, held my head high, and whispered inside, "Not tonight, not here." I could have turned away, swallowed the humiliation, and disappeared quietly into the background. That is what they expected. But instead, I chose to stand my ground. What they did not know was that the power in that room was not theirs to control. And as I reached into my clutch and caught the eye of the young waiter, the story of my life, the pain, the sacrifices, the years of silence was about to rise to the surface. I was 40 when my world broke apart. One late evening, the phone rang, and within minutes, my husband was gone. A car accident, sudden and merciless. I remember the sterile hallway of the hospital, the smell of disinfectant, the echo of footsteps, and the way my knees threatened to give out under me. In a single night, I became a widow. I became a single mother to a teenage boy who still needed so much from me. I wanted to collapse, but when I looked at Michael's face, I knew I couldn't. If I gave in to despair, he would lose not just a father, but a mother too. So I forced myself to keep standing. The years after that were a blur of work. I had no choice but to piece together a life with whatever jobs I could find. During the day, I sat behind the reception desk at a small law office, answering phones with a voice that I tried to keep steady. At night, I scrubbed office floors, my hands raw from bleach and my back aching as I dragged heavy trash bags down long hallways. On weekends, I stood in the steaming kitchen of an Italian restaurant, scrubbing dishes until my fingers cracked. There were months when I barely slept 3 or 4 hours a night. Sometimes, when the alarm rang at 5 in the morning, I whispered to myself, "Get up, Linda, keep moving." That simple phrase became my lifeline. At first, I believed I was just surviving, but with each job, I absorbed lessons I didn't even realize I was collecting. I studied how the chef managed his staff, how servers smoothed over angry customers, how invoices and deliveries kept a business running. I was learning, piece by piece, what it took to build something lasting. Meanwhile, Michael was growing up. He wanted what every boy wanted: new sneakers, money for school trips, a chance to blend in with his friends. Too often, I had to say no. Each time I did, it felt like another little cut to my heart. The hardest moment of all came the day I realized I had no other option but to sell my wedding ring. That gold band was the last physical reminder of the life I had with my husband. but it was the only way to pay Michael's first year of college tuition. I placed it in a small box, slid it across the pawnshop counter, and when I walked out, I pressed my hand against my chest as if I could still feel it there. That night, I cried into my pillow, silently, so Michael wouldn't hear. But the next morning, when he hugged me and promised he would make me proud, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. When the acceptance letter came from the university, I almost fell to the floor from relief and joy. I clapped so hard at orientation that my hands ached for days. I believed all my sacrifices had brought us closer. I believed he saw me as the reason he could step into that new world with his head held high. But I was wrong. The more Michael rose into that polished life of privilege and success, the further away he drifted from me. At first, I told myself it was normal. College was demanding. He was surrounded by new friends who came from families that looked nothing like ours. But deep down, I felt the distance growing, and it scared me. That fear only grew as the years went on, until it led us straight to that night at the restaurant, where everything I had endured and everything I had given up would be tested in front of a room full of strangers. That night at the restaurant was meant to be a celebration. I had dressed in my best navy dress, the one I had worn to church on Easter Sunday, and told myself that no matter how different Michael's life had become, I would still be welcome. He had just earned a promotion, and I wanted to be there to honor him. A mother's pride is not something that fades. The restaurant shimmered with chandeliers, soft music drifting across the room. I walked slowly, my steps heavy but steady, until I reached the long table at the center. That was when I noticed it 2 chairs only, one for Michael, one for Caroline, none for me. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Surely someone would notice, wave me over, make space. I stood there for a moment too long, trying to keep my face calm. And then I heard it, my son's voice, sharp and loud enough for everyone nearby to catch. He told me I didn't belong at that table, that maybe I would feel more comfortable sitting outside with beggars. The sound of it cut through me like glass. My own son, the boy I had raised through sleepless nights and endless sacrifices, speaking of me as though I were nothing more than a burden. Caroline's laughter followed, soft and mocking. She leaned into her wine glass, savoring the sting of her words, letting me know that in her eyes I was out of place, a shadow in a world of glittering wealth and polished lives. I felt heat rise up my neck, my hands shaking under the tablecloth I clutched, but I would not let them see me crumble. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and reminded myself quietly that dignity is something no one can strip away unless you hand it to them. The entire dining hall grew still. I could sense eyes on me. Forks paused in midair. Conversations halted. I was the center of their attention, but not in the way I had ever imagined. It should have been the lowest moment of my life, but instead, something inside me stirred. I knew I had a choice: walk away in shame, or take a step that would change everything. And as I caught the eye of a young waiter hovering nervously nearby, I decided I would not leave in silence. This was only the beginning. When I motioned for the young waiter, he looked startled, almost unsure whether he should step closer. I leaned toward him and whispered something so quietly that only he could hear. His eyes widened, and he nodded quickly before disappearing toward the kitchen. I could feel Michael watching me, that familiar smirk tugging at his lips, certain that I had simply begged for a chair. In his mind, this was proof of my weakness, something he could laugh about later with Caroline. And Caroline, with her perfect posture and expensive smile, tilted her head as if to savor the sight of me finally humiliated. But what they didn't know was that I had been carrying a truth much heavier than their ridicule, a truth that would turn that room upside down. I set my small leather clutch on the table with a deliberate thud. The sound carried across the silence, drawing the attention of guests who were already leaning forward, curious. My voice was calm, but steady enough to travel through the hush. I reminded myself that if anyone was leaving that table in disgrace tonight, it would not be me. Then the manager of the restaurant walked out from the back, his expression respectful, his tone warm as he greeted me by name. And not just my name, but with the kind of familiarity reserved for someone of importance. A ripple of shock moved through the dining hall. Before I could even process their reactions, another man entered. Raymond Blake, the chairman of the restaurant group, a figure known in the city for his power and presence. He walked toward me with a bow of his head, thanking me for my years of support. Around us, whispers rose like a tide. Forks clinked softly as if the entire room was trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. I glanced at Michael and Caroline. Their faces had gone pale, the arrogance draining away as confusion set in. They could not understand why men of such standing were addressing me with respect. The waiter returned and placed an envelope by my hand. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady as I slid the documents across the table toward my son. Ownership certificates, contracts stamped and sealed, all bearing my signature. Michael's breath caught as he skimmed the pages. The disbelief on his face was almost painful to watch. Caroline snatched one of the papers, scanning it with growing panic, before shaking her head as though denial could erase the truth. But there was no denying it. Without me, that restaurant would never have existed. I had been a quiet investor for years, pouring my savings, my late nights of learning, my sacrifices into something solid. I had built a foundation no one in that room had ever seen coming. I leaned closer, my voice low but unwavering, and let them both sit with the truth the woman they had mocked, the one they had tried to erase, was in fact the reason the very table before them stood at all. The applause that followed was not for Michael's promotion. It was for me. And yet, as powerful as that moment was, I knew the night was far from over. My son was about to learn that respect could never be bought with a glass of champagne. It had to be earned. For a moment, the applause felt like thunder rolling across the room. But when it faded, all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Michael sat stiff, his face drained of color, while Caroline clutched her glass as though it might anchor her to the ground. I looked at them both and felt the weight of years pressing down. The truth was out, but I knew that one revelation would never be enough. Respect cannot be forced by a single moment. It must be shaped, tested, and earned. So I reached into my clutch again and placed a second envelope on the table. It was heavier, thicker, sealed with more than paper and ink. It carried every ounce of my disappointment, every scar from years of sacrifice dismissed as meaningless. My attorney had helped me prepare it, but the decision to use it tonight was mine alone. I explained, slowly and clearly, that this was my will, rewritten just weeks before. For years, Michael had been its sole heir. Even as he drifted away from me, even as arrogance replaced gratitude, I had clung to the hope that he might return to the values he once promised to uphold. But after the humiliation of that night, I could no longer leave my life's work in the hands of someone who had forgotten what truly matters. The will was now conditional. If Michael wanted to inherit anything from me, if Caroline hoped to share in that future, they would have to meet 6 demands. First, they would volunteer at a nursing home every weekend for 1 full year. Not for photographs, not for show, but to sit with the forgotten, listen to their stories, and feel the weight of loneliness that too many elders carry. Second, they would leave their luxury home behind and live in a modest apartment, no more than $4,000 a month, to remember what it means to live within limits. Third, they would work in one of my restaurants, not as managers, not as owner's family, but as servers on their feet, carrying trays, apologizing when things went wrong, and learning humility from the ground up. Fourth, they would write public letters of apology, one to his company and one to the local newspaper, acknowledging the arrogance that had blinded them. Fifth, they would visit me every week, not to tick a box, but to sit, share, and truly listen. And finally, the most important, if at any point they slipped back into disrespect or arrogance, the inheritance would vanish, redirected entirely to charity. I let the silence sit heavy. Guests who had been watching with curiosity now stared wide-eyed. Some whispered. Some shook their heads. Others nodded as if they understood. Caroline's composure cracked, her voice sharp with protest. But I felt no anger, only clarity. I told them they could walk away if they found it too much. But if they wanted a future, they would have to earn it, step by step. As I looked at Michael's tearful eyes, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. Maybe this was the only way to reach the son I once knew. When the conditions were laid out, I expected resistance, perhaps even outright refusal. And at first, that was exactly what I saw. Caroline's face twisted with disbelief, her pride too heavy to allow humility. Michael sat frozen, torn between anger and fear. Yet slowly, the reality sank in the life they clung to so tightly had been built on money they had never earned. If they wanted to hold on to any of it, they would have to change. The very next week, movers carried boxes out of their pristine suburban home. I stood at a distance as Michael locked the door for the last time, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of a life stripped bare. Their new apartment was small, the kind of place where footsteps echoed on scuffed floors and the kitchen barely fit a table for 2. Caroline muttered about the peeling paint and the cramped closets, but there was no escape from the reality I had chosen for them. Their first shift at one of my restaurants was even harder. Michael put on the black apron of a server and tried to mask the shame in his eyes. When a guest snapped at him for forgetting a glass of water, he flushed red, his pride colliding with humility for the first time. Caroline, stationed at the host stand, stumbled over greetings and strained to hide her irritation when guests complained. By the end of the night, both leaned against the wall, exhausted, their clothes damp with sweat. Week after week, they returned. At the nursing home, Michael learned patience as he sat across from an elderly man who beat him at chess again and again. Caroline, awkward at first, found herself knitting clumsy scarves beside a woman who had no visitors. Slowly, the sharpness in her voice softened. I watched from a distance, never letting them forget that the lessons were not about money, but about respect. There were setbacks, Caroline slipping away one Saturday to shop instead of serve, Michael snapping at rude customers before catching himself. But each time, I reminded them that growth is not easy, and that one misstep could undo everything. Over time, though, I began to see flickers of change. Apologies offered without prompting. Small acts of kindness done when no one was watching. For the first time in years, I allowed myself a fragile hope. The true test, however, was still to come. By late autumn, I had gathered reports from the managers and the staff who worked beside Michael and Caroline. Their words carried more weight than any performance I could have staged. They spoke of a man who apologized when he was wrong, who stayed late to help, who bowed his head when pride once ruled him. They spoke of a woman who once turned her nose up at simple tasks, but now folded napkins, cleared tables, and even listened when others offered advice. I invited them to my small apartment, nothing grand, just the place where I had built my quiet life. As they sat across from me, I read those notes aloud. My voice was steady, but my heart trembled with every sentence. Then I asked them the only question that mattered: were they changing because of fear, or because of who they wanted to be? Michael's eyes filled with tears as he admitted that at first, fear had pushed him. But now shame and regret had forced him to look inward. Caroline, softer than I had ever known her, confessed that she had once thought I sought revenge. But what I had really given her was a mirror. Their words did not erase the pain of that night, but they opened the door to something new. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. I finalized my will soon after. A large portion to charity, another to a fund for mothers abandoned by their children, and the rest for Michael and Caroline if they continued on the path they had begun. As I lit a candle that evening, I whispered into the silence, "Dignity is not something others hand you. It is something you claim, even when the world tries to take it away." To anyone listening, hold fast to your worth. If my story touched you, share your own in the comments. Let's make sure no one walks this road feeling alone.